The level of craft, the high level of creativity that you find in these works can rival anything in the world. Anything.
The achievements of artists of color. That's what it's about.
Turn the museum to face the city and say, this is a story that you've never seen, because nobody's seen it.
When it comes to modern art, we haven't seen the full picture. There are stories untold, formative works unseen. There are blind spots in the collection of the nation's most prominent art museums.
When you're talking about people whose pasts are always being discarded by others as unimportant, not written down, not preserved in museums, not taught in school, which is hugely important. So the fight is not against the past alone, the fight is against erasure, the constant erasing of Black artists, Black accomplishments, the real history of Reconstruction.
Telling this story is the role of a new art show called Solidary and Solitary. For 3 years, the show will travel the nation in an attempt to show a fuller spectrum of Black American painters and artists. Curators say that telling this story requires understanding the key role of abstract painter Norman Lewis.
Behind me is a beautiful painting by Norman Lewis, who is the sort of focal point for the starting point for the exhibition, where it all springs from. And he was a hugely important mentor, both in person and as a symbol for almost all the artists in the exhibition.
Norman Lewis was close friends with painters Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, Franz Klein, Robert Motherwell. We remember his friends as some of the giants of abstract expressionism. But Lewis, like other Black artists from that era, is not remembered in the same way. Within his lifetime, he did not reach the same fame or financial success.
Only recently did Norman Lewis break $1 million at auction, and he's a key figure of the ABEX movement. I bought a Norman Lewis painting for the BMA recently that was $165,000, and it hangs next to a Mark Rothko that could sell at auction for between 150 and 200 million conservatively. So I think economics rarely lie.
So while Lewis's more famous friends could sell one painting and live for a year, his work sold for a fraction. For years, accounts of art history failed to recognize his role.
There is a very famous photograph of Norman Lewis sitting around a table amongst all of the great names that come out of 1950s abstract expressionism. Rothko is there, Ed Reinhardt, his good friend, is there, Clifford Still is there, all of these great people are there. And yet I've never heard anyone until very recently begin to talk about the fact that he was quite literally at the table and yet not recognized by the Museum of Modern Art. The real question here becomes not of making a new history, making additions. This is about just recognizing what really happened.
I can imagine there were times when he was literally cropped out because the environment really didn't know how to process Norman. He was literally at the table, part of the conversation, and was written out of history. So we're endeavoring to reframe that.
Through the paintings, Joyner believes people can better understand this history.
That is the mission of the collection, which is to do nothing less ambitious than to reframe the full arc of the full canon of art history and help to insert those voices that were, for a whole host of reasons, overlooked.
Lewis did not paint portraits or landscapes or other recognizable images. He was an abstract painter who worked more with forms and colors.
So the beauty of Mr. Lewis was that he could play with anybody. And he knew he was brilliant. And he knew that he was being rejected.
Other older artists in the Joyner-Jafrida exhibition, painters like Jack Whitten, Sam Gilliam, Charles Gaines, and sculptors like Mel Edwards, also bucked the art world's expectations of them.
By painting in the abstract mode, they were doing something they weren't supposed to be doing as artists of color.
They were making art purely for the sake of making and not necessarily for thinking about marketplace and all that stuff, because that was not going to happen.
In his art classes, Bechet uses a Lewis painting called Afternoon to help explain the conception of abstraction.
First, the thing I see is this big burst of light and big understanding of color, but then you see the sort of dark colors in that yellow. He was literally trying to figure out how to incorporate what was going on in his lifetime, what was going on with the marches in the civil rights movement. I tell my students all the time, the way that he did this was far more impactful than if he would have tried to paint each individual marcher.
Yet people didn't expect Norman Lewis to paint this way.
Now, one of the reasons had to do with race, because the expectation in the 1940s, when Norman started painting in an abstract mode, was that artists of color needed to paint identifiably black subject matter. And so there was this notion that Norman was less legitimate because he wasn't doing that.
Norman Lewis was a generous mentor to many artists in the exhibition and to New Orleans artist Willie Birch.
For somebody like me who love history, and you study those cats because you understand that there's a spiritual element within that work, it changed the whole dynamics.
Still, Lewis was caught in the shadows, in life and in death.
Keep in mind, Norman Lewis right now is probably one of the most recognized African-American artists, although when he died in the late 70s, a friend of mine, a writer named Gilbert Coker, tried to write a lot of what I'm telling you now in an article in the Village Voice, and I had bet her that the Village Voice wouldn't publish it. Village Voice wouldn't publish it.
You've got to show the face of the artist that made the work if you want to change the level of identification between that object and a new public. So to put that really frankly, this is an exhibition of work by Black Americans.
That's what it's about. And it's about their place in art history.
Creating an exhibit that spotlights 5 generations took driven collectors like Joyner and Jafrida.
But the bottom line is that there are pieces in that show, like Sam Gilliam, sheer genius, like Mel Edwards, sheer genius, like Norman Lewis, sheer genius, you understand me? That can sit on the wall with anything that we've ever created in terms of, the human existence of why we create.
For decades, even centuries, museums took little notice of art made by Black Americans.
My parents both grew up in the Deep South, in the Jim Crow South, at a moment of stark change in this country. Education was valued in my household. They really just thought it was part of my education for me to take music lessons and ballet lessons. I'd go every Saturday dutifully to my lessons, which took place across the street from the Art Institute of Chicago. So between lessons, I went every single week to the Art Institute of Chicago, which was free. Something that was characteristic of American museums, decades ago, was that if you're a person of color, you could have walked into those museums and not have seen yourself in the figures or in the makers.
2 decades ago, Joyner began to collect art, focusing on pieces created at a time when museums and galleries rarely showed art by Black artists and women.
I guess what I think is there's the solo and duet idea. Our collecting habits over time, and we're not alone in this sin, have not reflected a commitment to Black creativity. They just haven't. So I think it took somebody like Pamela to be the sort of catalyst and the activist and the creative spark necessary for museums to change course.
It was in pursuit of this story that Joyner's collection took shape.
Once you come to that conclusion that art is simply art, the race thing should be secondary.
Today, artists go out of their way to give Joyner singular pieces. Painter Charles Gaines had planned a series of 8 of these distinctive Central Park trees painted through grids. But he added one more, number 9, to the series and gave it to Joyner for her collection. Sculptor Leonardo Drew describes Joyner when she sees new, exciting work.
She starts vibrating. I said, okay. She saw this piece. It was under plastic. I tell you no lie. It was up way, I hang these things in order to store them way up high. And it was under plastic because we try to keep the dust off it. She says, I want that one right there. And I'm like, I said, but she's just messing with me, man. Because it's like, there's no way she could know what's under that plastic. And it's like, and she knew, it was like she just knew.
Joyner helped fill what she calls blind spots in the modern art collections of some of the world's most prominent museums.
You know, I bought a number of things and I said, well, how can we systematize this to make a difference? So if I had unlimited resources, which I don't, I would collect Norman Lewis and buy the Jackson Pollock or the Mark Rothko and hang him in that context.
When Ron Boucher was a student, he met painter Sam Gilliam. That introduction is seared in Boucher's memory.
It had a profound influence on me. To be able to just see a Black man making art at that time was significant, you know, for a young, aspiring Black artist.
Artist Willie Birch says Gilliam stripped conventional boundaries when he freed the canvas from the frame, an important transformation for the modernist movement.
Simple, but he fractured it because he put them within a formal context, changed the whole dynamics of it, took the whole thing off the stretcher.
He got the understanding of those pieces from watching his mother and his grandmother hang clothes on the clothesline. That for me was a profound statement. It meant to me that I could actually think about and use those things that I see and understand in my own culture.
To working artists, the Joyner Jafrida exhibit does more than fill in gaps of art history. It illustrates the pivotal role of Black creativity in this country's art.
I would say that these artists are going beyond the 4 corners of the canvas and attempting to actually change the world. That's different.
House paint, paper, fabric, found objects, works of art so tactile and alive that it's hard not to reach out and touch them.
A lot of it is what I can relate to. Definitely with the house dresses. Like, makes me think of my grandmother's house, and when I used to spend a lot of summers. She's from South Georgia.
Innovation with everyday stuff is one of the signatures of Joyner's collection.
Because it opens doors to bigger and probably more of substantial realizations of a collective self. Not just me, but all of us who've touched those materials and all of us who've had these experiences.
Sometimes it's not the materials, but the methods that are innovative. Creators largely unknown to curators until recently.
There are a lot of ways to be abstract, and a lot of them are really boring. And this show is sort of visually scintillating and formally wildly inventive, and it means something.
Artist Kevin Beasley incorporates New York Yankees caps into his work.
The young men who wear the caps, the policemen who are looking at the men who wear the caps, to move beyond that as well and to turn them into something else that is beautiful, It's like a giant bouquet of those caps.
Artist Mark Bradford starting using curler papers from his mom's hair salon in his works. Now, paper strips cascade with cords 4 stories high.
Who would have thought, with Mark Bradford that, you take found pieces of paper from posters and so on, and you can make something so beautiful and intricate.
Shanique Smith makes collages using found fabric, ribbons, and small, commonly seen objects like decals of black butterflies.
It's like the devil is in the details, except that the great intelligence of these works is in the details.
Details that define the artist's signature styles. By incorporating materials and insight from the world around them, they create a critical reflection of the realities of today.
So it's always of the world in a really profound way, and therefore about the artists and also about all of us. And I think that fact in combination with the way the material looks in the gallery is electrifying.
Solidary and solitary refers to artists who both have relationships with each other, solidary, and are fierce individualists who scoff at being put into categories.
So it had very little to do with like, oh my, just, the black art.
We together have to sit down and understand what this really means. And this construct of race, I guess I'm an optimist in a lot of ways, that we can go through it together. That's the only way it's going to happen. And to an understanding that, people are different, but we're the same.
You study any movement in the so-called art world, and I'm just talking about America now, you're gonna find a black dude right there. Now, how they write us out or write us in becomes important.
You're born an artist. You're gonna make, my mother's just trying to beat the daylights out of me to get me to stop making art. I'm an addict. So that's, you know what I'm saying? It had nothing to do, oh, I'm a black artist. No, I have to make art. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, just get out of my way, Mom.
That sense of independence was at the root of abstract expressionism.
The work is what it is, right? Work is what it is. Without you actually having to say anything. If it's like has a punch, it's gonna punch you,
It's very different and it's very creative, and I don't think I've ever seen anything like this before.
And that fits one of the exhibition's goals, to inspire young artists of all colors.
But as a teacher who has spent a lot of time with young artists, the thing that I am the most excited about is what it means for a young artist of color to come into a room and say, oh, that could be me. I could do that.
A lot of young people are gonna see that and realize that they don't have to paint figures, that there are other choices that they have in terms of this creative process. So it expands the whole dialogue of creativity.
This painting, it's very colorful and it's very unique and abstract. I feel like I wouldn't really see this in most museums.
It also teaches us a lesson, all of us, I think, who try to write histories and books in institutions and museums to teach histories, what's wrong with the way we've taught history. Who is it left out, but how the very shape of history and throwing away the past has been a mistake in certain ways.
This is a story that you've never seen because nobody's seen it. And we're going to use this as a way not only to correct the canon to tell a different history, but we're going to use these objects as discussion points that broaden to consider the conditions of the social world.
More than a half-century has passed since Norman Lewis and the Spiral Group worked to see art transcend race.
We play on a big-time scale. So anybody who saw that show could not deny the genius of what those brothers and sisters brought to the plate.
Now the frame is being shifted, and if the future generation of artists learn the full history, they can better tap into their own inner genius. That's Joyner's belief.
I say pursue your passion, Make sure you're good at it. And thanks to all these people who came before you who had a different struggle than you face, you have the latitude to be as successful as your own talent and will allow you to be.
Mm-hmm.